I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of the conference and also thanking you all for coming to hear me today. I'm going to talk about the approach that we are taking at Harvard University to commercializing the university's technologies. And like Tim, I should probably apologize in advance that I also don't speak any Spanish, unfortunately. Actually, I've been living in the US for a long time, and I feel at this point the US is becoming sort of a bilingual country, and really everybody should really speak some Spanish, but I'm originally from Canada, and in Canada people speak English or French, and that's pretty much all we speak. So I thought I would just begin with a little bit about myself. So I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of a program called the Blavatnik Biomedical Accelerator at Harvard University. That's primarily what I'll talk to you about today. Before this, I was the founder of a biotech company in Boston called CombinatorX, and I did that for 8 years. I was the founder and I was the chief scientist at that company, and I'll just briefly mention something about that. But I did my PhD at Harvard in the 1990s as well, so I have been in the Boston area for a long time. And actually, I just kind of follow up on a comment earlier made referring to me from Cambridge. In fact, Harvard University is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's a part of Boston, and what happened was many years ago when Harvard was still not very well known or not very well respected, the people in the town where Harvard was located decided to rename the town Cambridge in hopes of getting some of the respect that was associated with Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. So hopefully it worked and that Harvard has gained some respect over the years. So very briefly, I thought I would mention the company that I was the founder of years ago. So this, I won't go into the details, but in short, this was a company that we created for discovering novel and non-obvious combinations of compounds to find synergy between compounds in a very high throughput manner. And this was something that really had not been done. Back in 2000, it was sort of the beginning of high throughput screening and cell-based models of disease. Probably many of the researchers in the room work with cell-based models of disease. So this was our system really focused on looking in a way that was not biased initially, looking for synergistic effects between compounds. And we did this initially with approved drugs, so compounds that were already known to be safe for use in humans. And eventually we moved on to other compounds. But over the course of the 8 years, we created a broad pipeline of clinical programs. Actually, when I left the company in 2008, we had 7 clinical trials underway. And we had raised about $250 million US to support the company's activities. So really the reason I'm mentioning this company is because I want to give you the sense that at Harvard, all of us who are involved in the technology transfer activities of the university, we all have backgrounds much like this. I'm not sure if the slides are advancing or if I need to do that using this one. I guess I need to do this. So I mention this because, again, the idea is that all of us at Harvard who are involved in tech transfer, we all have real-world experience. Either we have founded companies in the past, or in some cases, we have people who were perhaps licensing executives at pharmaceutical companies or that kind of experience. But the idea is it's not just academic experience. There is business experience for the people involved in tech transfer at Harvard. Okay, so Harvard. You know, I think probably it comes as no surprise to you to say that Harvard is, in addition to a very well-respected teaching institution, you know, we have a very broad, diverse research base. And I'll advance. Just a little bit of information about some statistics in terms of Harvard's research base. So primarily, I think people might associate the research at Harvard as being at the Harvard Medical School or perhaps the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, but it's also the case that we have research going on across the university. And in recent years, although our schools like the medical school and the School of Public Health have not really significantly increased in size, Harvard has in the last decade added on additional research institutes, such as the Wyss Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering. And I mention that one because I think it also highlights an important trend at Harvard, but also at a lot of American universities, where the funding of research within the university is increasingly coming from new sources. Federal funding from the government, that's unfortunately stayed flat or is in some cases decreasing depending on how you measure it. And so the Wyss Institute was founded by a donor to Harvard University who gave the money to create this. His name was Hans-Jörg Wyss. And this is an increasing trend at Harvard. And the program that I run, that I'll tell you about, was also funded through philanthropy from a graduate of Harvard University. So, even though as we do have this very broad research base, if you look at the distribution on the right, you'll see that fundamentally we still are a life sciences institution. Most of our principal investigators, over 3/4 of our principal investigators, are in the life sciences. We are relatively weak in the physical sciences, at least when compared to MIT, which is down the road from us. And we sometimes feel envy about their physical science strength, but I think that is something that Harvard is working on over time. So for a university with as broad a research base as this, I guess the question arises, how do we make sure that we fulfill our responsibility of getting this potentially valuable research that's going on within the walls, getting it out to benefit society? And in the United States, I'm not sure if everybody in this audience would know, but in 1980, there was a piece of legislation put in place in the United States called the Bayh-Dole Act. And that gave universities the responsibility for commercializing the intellectual property assets that were generated by the professors within the university and that were funded through federal funding, NIH, National Science Foundation, and so on. So under the Bayh-Dole Act, it gives universities both, in a sense, the privilege, but also the responsibility to make sure that we are effectively commercializing the technologies at the university. And so within Harvard, the office that does that, the office where I work, is called the Office of Technology Development. And again, we really see it as a mission that we have, which is to maximize the translational impact of the research at Harvard, and to do that through forming partnerships with companies, starting new companies, and I guess secondarily I should say that we also believe that we have a responsibility of ensuring that Harvard does receive fair compensation for the technologies that we're putting out into the public sector. And that's Harvard, but it's also for the inventors, our professors. And, and this is in part because the money that comes back into Harvard is primarily used to fund research going forward as well. And so that is the main motivation for us in terms of thinking of the financial compensation of the deals that we do. The strategy, the core strategy at least for our university, is that we try to create intellectual property assets that are of real value. As Tim said, there are certainly cases where there are mechanisms for commercializing our technologies where perhaps patent protection is not strong. But for us, our core strategy is in fact to build valuable intellectual property, valuable patents that then can be licensed into new companies or to existing companies. But we are involved in a number of other activities, and certainly fostering entrepreneurship is a big part of what our office is now thinking about, although I think since Tim spoke quite a bit about that, I will not focus too much on that today. So a few statistics for you to give you a sense of Harvard's engine of innovation, we sometimes call this. These are numbers for, I apologize, they're actually slightly out of date numbers. They're a couple of years ago. But I think they're pretty representative. Things have increased a little bit in the last 2 years, but you can see that in I think, fiscal 2015, we received at our office approximately 500 reports of, what are called reports of invention within the Harvard system, where a professor officially disclosed to us something that they saw as a potentially patentable discovery or invention. Now, those don't come out of the blue. The way that these reports come to us is because all of our business development team, and at Harvard there are 50 people in our office, but there are about 10 people who are regularly working with the faculty to learn about their research and to start to think about whether a patent should be filed. So most of these reports of invention come through interactions that we in our office have with our faculty and encourage them to submit that to us. Approximately half of these then we file provisional patent applications on those. So in that year, you can see 243 provisional patent applications were filed on those reports. Overall, at any given time, now I think we're probably up to about 2,300 active patents that Harvard would be managing in terms of a patent portfolio. Those patents support, perhaps in fiscal 2015, 651 licenses that were done with 361 different partners. So 361 different industry partners, companies, large companies, small companies, startups, had some sort of formal licensing arrangement with Harvard University. So just wanted to give you a sense of the scale at which things are at Harvard. Now, there are other universities within the United States that these numbers are larger, in fact, because Harvard, up until recently, Harvard was not known to have been a particularly effective tech transfer operation. I think that really changed in the last 10 years. And so now we've seen a big increase. And some of the larger state universities within the US would have larger numbers perhaps than this. In terms of our general strategy, as I mentioned, our team goes out and meets with the faculty and really tries to understand their research and understand what it is that they're looking for. So we call this a faculty-centric approach. And the idea is really to build a relationship of trust between the business people within our office and the faculty, and understand, is it primarily at this point that the researcher is looking for new funding to come into their lab to fund research? Usually that is the case. I think pretty much all researchers would like to have additional funding. But in other cases, there may be a situation where there's a body of work that's been done over the course of many years, and where the investigator feels that they are ready now to see it go into the hands of an industrial partner that has the additional expertise that would be needed to develop it. So, I think that, again, it's this idea of not just assuming we know what the professor needs. It's really a matter of us going out, forming a relationship, understanding their science and where it stands, and then helping them figure out what should happen next. I won't say too much about this, but like any tech transfer office, we have to look at this question of whether or not the most appropriate vehicle for a technology is to form a new startup company, or is it to license the technology to an existing company? I think that really there are certain rules of thumb, as they're called, that people use in terms of the breadth of a platform technology may be more suited for a startup. I think that is often the kind of way in which we operate, although very often now, things have changed, at least in the US, where even cases where maybe you just have a single compound that might be a potential drug lead, in the past it would have been said that that is not suitable for a startup company, that should be licensed to a pharmaceutical company. But things are changing now. I think in the US, very often a single asset like that might go into a company that is a very virtual company without bricks and mortar. It's without any labs, but everything is done virtually. So I think there are no easy hard and fast rules. So again, it's really a matter of us talking it over with the professor to understand, for example, how involved they want to be going forward. I think that's a key question. Some professors want to be very, very intimately involved in the next steps that will follow in terms of development, whereas others really just want to do kind of a handoff of the technology to someone else. And this is this is an example of some of the startup companies that have come out of Harvard in recent years. So I just wanted to include this because it has some names of companies that you may be familiar with. I think the one that maybe has gotten the most media attention recently has been Editas. So those who are familiar with the CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing technologies, the gene editing technology, that is Editas, and that came out of Harvard just a few years ago. And as you can see, many of these companies have raised quite a bit of money. In my program, we were involved with 2 of these companies, and I'm going to use them as examples in upcoming slides. And then I think one last comment about general technology transfer activities at Harvard. There's been a trend that we've taken on in the last 5 to 10 years, which is to form very broad strategic alliances between Harvard and large companies. And this is something that really happens very often. What happens, the history is often that a company may have an interest in one of our most well-known professors in a particular area. So let's say immuno-oncology as an example. And the company will come to us and say, we would like to work with Professor X on their whatever they have going on in terms of their new technologies for immuno-oncology. And we take that as an opportunity then to say, well, that's great that you want to work with Professor X, but additionally we have Professor Y and Professor Z who are also working in immuno-oncology. Perhaps you would like to form a larger relationship between Harvard and your company where you can regularly hear about and access these technologies. And in fact, we'll often go one step further even where maybe right now the company is interested in the adaptive immune system for immuno-oncology, but we'll say, maybe down the road you want to look at the potential of the innate immune system for immuno-oncology. So you could do a request for proposals that we will help you send around all of Harvard University, which will help you identify the most interesting new things that are going on in an area that maybe you don't know it right now, but you're going to know it next year. So these are these large strategic alliances that Harvard has been setting up with pharmaceutical companies, Roche and others, but also ones in the life sciences, and Tata, for example, is one that was in the last year or so. And you can see from the measure on the right side of the slide that the amount of funding that we have been bringing into Harvard through industry has really significantly increased in the last 10 years. It's probably the largest increase in terms of our metrics for our programs. Okay, so now I'm going to take hopefully about 10 minutes to tell you about the program that specifically I run within Harvard. So it's called the Blavatnik Biomedical Accelerator. And it's funny because I think sometimes people hear about Harvard and they say, oh, well, you must really not have to do, it must kind of happen naturally at Harvard that, companies come to you and they say, what do you have? And we show it to them and they say, great, we'll take it. And unfortunately, it's not like that at all. Because the reality is that even at Harvard, maybe particularly at Harvard, the research is still very early stage. From the perspective of what it is that companies like to see generally, or venture capitalists would like to see, our research is still very early. Has lots of potential, but it usually needs further development. And so we created this accelerator within the university where we can invest relatively small amounts of money with the goal of advancing the technologies to a point where they will be ready for partnership. And so apologize. So this is just some overview of the program, a little bit of history. We started this when I came back to Harvard in 2008. We started with $10 million that had been given to us by Harvard alumni. And then in 2013, we received an additional $35 million from Len Blavatnik and the Blavatnik Family Foundation. So Len Blavatnik went to Harvard Business School. He's been very generous to Harvard and to Oxford and to other universities, and he really wanted to support this program and see if he could help Harvard commercialize its biomedical technologies. In terms of our core strategy, I think, many universities have created programs sort of like this. I think what I would say is that in our case, probably the most central element is that everything that we fund, any activities that we provide our money to, these are very closely aligned with what we have heard from companies or investors that they want to see. And I think this is one of the weaknesses of drug discovery centers, for example, within universities, is often people are going off in a different direction, that it's not really grounded in the reality of what companies or investors are looking for. And our program at Harvard is that we really try to make sure that we work only in those therapeutic areas where we know that if we are successful with the project, there will be a partner at the end of it. Because if there is no partner, then the money was not well spent. We make our investment decisions in part through an independent advisory committee of venture capitalists and people from industry, and I manage that process. Ultimately, the decision lies with Harvard University, but we rely heavily on their recommendations. And also, this was set up as an evergreen fund, and that term, I'm not sure if it translates well, but it means that any of the license revenue that comes in from the technologies that we have funded, 20% of that money goes back into my program to fund future technologies. So the goal is that one day we will be self-sustaining. I think at the moment we're still early on, and none of our projects have actually reached, have become products generating revenue yet, but we are bringing in money now through milestones that we are receiving in our partnerships with companies. I think in the interest of time, I won't say too much about this, but I think, the basic idea that you can see here is that we view this occurring over 4 different stages, quite a significant process where we go about identifying the opportunities from around Harvard, where we go out. At this point, I would have met probably with all of the faculty who are working, and I understand what they're working on. And so every, twice a year now, we say, all right, do you feel ready to apply formally for some funding? And we meet with them to craft a proposal that we think could be of interest for funding. We have quite a long diligence process. So this is internal diligence in terms of the intellectual property, but also this step that I call evaluate. This is where we spend many months going out and meeting with more companies to discuss each of these technologies that we're considering. And we would normally talk to maybe 5 to 10 venture capitalists. We would talk to maybe 5 to 10 companies and say, here's what it is. Will you work with us right now? If they work with us right now, it doesn't need accelerator funding. But if they say, we need to see these 3 additional things, then we look at whether or not we can provide enough funding to do the experiments to try and check those boxes. The managed step of this, so there's a group of us who are functioning really as project managers, and I should explain that a lot of the money that we give for these projects, some of it goes to the professor's lab to do certain things, but the majority of the money actually goes outside of the university to do work at contract research organizations. So doing pharmacokinetic studies, to do chemistry optimization of compounds, things like that. So the project managers within my group are really running these sort of little virtual biotech companies that are still being incubated within Harvard through the accelerator. And then at the end of the process, the partner step, at that point, myself and the members of my team, but also Harvard's broader business development team, goes back out and often talks to the same companies that we had spoken to at the evaluate stage and say, okay, 2 years have gone by, we showed what you asked us to show. Are you interested now in licensing the technology? And so it's the business development. And quite often, sometimes we hear, well, the world has changed, and sometimes we hear that. But generally, I think we do have a pretty good success. And actually, in terms of success metrics, actually, I'll skip these. Okay, so first, this is just a kind of an overview of what we've funded over the initial 9 years of this program. So we funded 93 different technologies around Harvard. You can see that it's primarily therapeutics, pharmaceuticals. Cancer is the largest group, but also infectious disease. Increasingly, we're seeing a lot of therapeutic technologies in regenerative medicine based on stem cell technologies coming out of Harvard. So those are a lot of them. But we also do have diagnostics and medical devices. So that's just an overview of what we have. As I said, in terms of the metrics, so of those 93 projects that we've funded, there are 63, and those have been funded with $17 million of direct funding for the projects. There's actually probably low 20, maybe $22 million has been spent in total on them when you take into account the money that we have paid for the intellectual property, for other activities that were not within the grant formally. But of those 93, 62 projects are now completed, and nearly half of the projects, this is kind of the bottom line punchline that we like to give, is that approximately half of the projects that we have funded, when completed, they lead to some sort of partnership with industry. And so we're pretty happy with that number. I think it's hard to know what to expect, but I think about 50%, I think we feel is quite a good ratio. Now, those projects have already, those deals that we've done, those 29 deals, have already started to bring back some money into Harvard. So it's brought in $20 million in license revenue. So that's money that is cash in. And as I said, through this evergreen mechanism, that means that $4 million of that has gone back into my program. And $30 million has come in follow-on research funding for the professors that we work with on these projects. Also, a number that's not on here is that the startups that we formed have now raised close to $500 million worth of venture funding. So, and actually some of them have gone public. So that's another measure of impact, I think, is how much capital has been raised by these companies. It's about $500 million. Now, I think I only have, I should just check, I have 5 minutes left, would you say? 5 minutes? Okay. So I won't go much into the examples that I had considered, but maybe I will choose, just choose 2 examples. So the first example is a startup company that that came out of the accelerator program. We were developing a technology for doing a milder version of bone marrow conditioning. And so I think many people know in the case of certain cancers, when you need bone marrow ablation, that it's very toxic, it's chemotherapy and radiation, it's usually used in the context of a disease like acute myeloid leukemia, and many people die. So we developed a technology that allowed a milder way of doing this using an immunotoxin. And then the idea for this was not just to make bone marrow transplant better, but actually to allow the use of hematopoietic stem cell therapy in the context of diseases where you just want to treat a milder condition like sickle cell anemia. So the idea is that, for example, if you could more gently remove the existing hematopoietic stem cells from a patient that does have sickle cell, you could then replace with engineered, gene-edited stem cells from that patient where you've corrected the sickle cell mutation. So that's sort of the concept for this platform technology. And we started a company last year in conjunction with 2 of our venture capitalists in Boston, and it called Magenta Therapeutics. And it received, in its Series A, raised $50 million, and then a few months later raised another $75 million. So already I think in 18 months, the company's raised about $125 million to pursue this technology. And then the last example, I won't go into the details of this, but I wanted to mention, whereas the previous example was a startup company we formed, this example is actually a license to the pharmaceutical company Merck. And I think universities often feel it's hard to do good deals with Merck and Pfizer and the big pharmaceutical companies. So this project was also a small molecule therapy for acute myeloid leukemia. And without going into the details, this is a project where we worked with the professor for actually 4 years. So we provided more funding for this project than any other we had before. We ended up spending, but still it was only in the range of maybe $1 to $1.5 million of direct research funding, and actually most of that money was spent at contract research organizations. Very little of that money was spent within the professor's lab. And this led, as a result of this, we did a license with Merck that was the largest, deal that Harvard has ever done with any company. In terms of the total financial consideration. The upfront payment that we received at the time of executing the deal was $20 million, but there were milestones that are also will be hit in the near future as well. So we were quite pleased with this because it did show that through some amount of patience and focus that we were able to advance compounds to a stage where they're ready for clinical trials and where we can then do a real partnership, that the kind of partnership a small biotech company would do with Merck. That's what we wanted to do, and we feel that we achieved that with this example. I'll only mention this, in terms of entrepreneurship, we do actually have a sister program that is called the Blavatnik Fellowship in Life Science Entrepreneurship. This is through Harvard Business School. So we're fortunate to have a strong business school at Harvard, but unfortunately, our business school, the people are generally not very entrepreneurial. It's known for being a business school where people go on to banking and that sort of path. And so we, with Len Blavatnik, our donor, created this program to try and encourage entrepreneurship. And basically, the short version is that people who have been recent graduates from Harvard MBAs, they work with our office for 1 year. We take 5 people per year. They work a bit as an entrepreneur in residence, and we spend the year helping them identify a technology that they will then launch a startup around. And this has been happening for 4 years now, and the success rate has been quite high. Usually because the idea is that this is an educational and training program for the people, the startups are usually relatively small. They're not $50 million for the first investment. They tend to be maybe a couple $1 million, but it's something where they can really kind of get going. So we think this both helps our MBA students as well as our scientists at Harvard by giving them people that they can partner with. And then I guess for my last slide, I will just mention that, I think it's also important to recognize that we're in a very fortunate situation in Boston. And there's something that I think we like to call the kind of a virtuous cycle. I'm not sure if that's a term that's used in Spanish. There's a vicious cycle is when things go badly, and the virtuous cycle is when things tend to work well together. And so we're fortunate in that we have many major research universities, obviously Harvard and the affiliated hospitals, also MIT, Tufts, Boston University. But in part, I think because of the major research universities, going back 20 years or more, we started to develop a community of very strong and vibrant venture capitalists in Boston. And that was in part, but not only, because of the universities that were there. Currently, they tend to be Third Rock, Flagship Atlas, but there are many others. So those two things fed on each other. Certainly, the venture capital community was drawn to the universities. Now, about 10 years ago, Massachusetts, the state government for us, started a program also, perhaps similar to some things that are being done here in Argentina, where there were grants, loans, tax breaks, and so on that were provided by the state government. And I think initially some of the people thought, oh, is that really necessary in Boston? But I think it turned out to be very important. And one of the things that resulted from it was a couple of biotech incubators that really had not existed in Boston before that. We did not have incubators where small companies could easily access the range of facilities that they needed. And one that's called Lab Central has been very successful, and it initially was made possible through this state funding, and now is really running independently and has done extremely well. Many interesting companies are coming out of Lab Central. The result of this is that there are now hundreds of biotech companies in Boston, and actually Massachusetts, and really Boston, receives over 1/3 of all of the seed stage funding for biotech in all of the United States. It's actually within Boston. And in terms of follow-on funding, if you were to exclude medical devices, if you just included biopharma, Boston is by far the largest recipient of funding. And again, I think these biotech companies resulted from the universities and from the venture capital community. Then the next step was that the pharmaceutical companies moved in, because when I graduated from Harvard in 2000, really none of the pharmaceutical companies were present in Boston. Novartis was the first to come, and in the last 17 years, essentially all of the pharmaceutical companies have relocated, if not their headquarters, they've located major research facilities to be near the biotech companies and to be near the universities. And so as a result, putting it all together, biopharma's jobs are really probably the fastest growing sector in Massachusetts, and really viewed by the governor as being one of the major drivers of growth in Massachusetts. So again, I think this is the kind of virtuous cycle that can be made possible in a number of different places around the world. It's not unique to Boston. It can really be done in other places, and I think one just has to think about the different components of it and the right incentives for them. And so I know we're tight on time, so perhaps I should just stop now, and I guess I can take a couple of questions.
Right, thank you very much, Dr. Keith. Yeah, I have a couple of questions here from the audience. The first one, I mean, you talked about intellectual property at the beginning of your talk. Given the fact that pursuing a patent application is not cheap and it's time consuming, I mean, what are the critical factors that you take into consideration when recommending scientists whether to go for a patent application or not?
Yeah, so this is always a tough question because within universities we have the challenge that our faculty publish, as we would hope they would do. The faculty are going to publish. And so that means that in many cases we have to make a decision earlier than would be ideal. Do we try to protect the invention before it's published? And I have to say that universities, and maybe this is seen here as well, universities are usually viewed as erring on the side of filing their patents too early, and they file them at a stage when the patents are really not ultimately going to be of much value because they cannot be sufficiently enabled. And so Harvard traditionally, I think, did have that challenge. So I think increasingly, though, maybe to answer your question, we have a very frank discussion with the professor to say, look, you're going to be publishing this. We can try to protect it. If it's very, very important, like the CRISPR technology that I referred to earlier, then we would say we have to file on it and try our best. But if it's something that is maybe not of that scale, or where we say to the professor, are you really going to be able to provide the data within a couple of years to enable the patents or what's being claimed here? And if the professor says, no, I probably will not be able to, then I think we will make a decision not to file. Now that's a new change for us. I think we probably still in some cases file a lot of provisionals early and then we abandon them. But also similarly there are questions about what countries to file in at later stages, and that's a bit of a tougher question as well.
And just sort of as a follow-up question, would you ever consider to take a project in where there is no chance to file a patent, for example, because the research has already been published, or that's a no-no?
We would consider it. I think in the end our unit of, we usually say our unit of currency for doing deals with industry is the patent. That's what we have to give. And it may be different, I think, in some other places. It might be different in the United Kingdom. But for us, if we do not have some sort of patent to be able to license to a startup, then the venture capitalists are unlikely to give us any significant consideration at all. And even in equity, we would not receive much. So I think, we usually try to think, is there some sort of patent that has some real value that can be created over the course of the project? Usually there is, to be honest. There's usually some sort of patent that can be created with value.
Another question, so for the startups that come out of your accelerator program, where do they raise funds after that?
So we're very often involved in that process ourselves. So we will go out and put together the initial pitch for what the startup would look like. We don't always do, sometimes our EIRs, our entrepreneurs in residence, do that. Sometimes the business development team will do that. And we will go out usually with the professor, maybe in the first or second discussions, and start making those pitches to the venture capitalists. Any of the venture capitalists in Boston, certainly we have very good connections with any of them and have the opportunity to to present the startup ideas.
Great. And the last one, what would you say are the main obstacles or barriers in the creation and commercialization of this intellectual property that you were talking about, not only talking about the US specifically, but also globally?
I think something that's probably true in the US and the rest of the world is that, at least with regard to doing partnerships with large existing companies, we still have, our technologies are still very early. And so that's why we created this program. So I think even after the small amount of funding that we can provide, we still do have a challenge that our technologies are still quite early. Usually that is offset by the fact that it's very innovative. You know, what we are doing is something that the companies are likely not doing themselves. So those things go hand in hand. I don't know if, I assume that is one of the same challenges that that universities around the world would have. I think we have some things are made easy for us, because if we call any of the pharmaceutical companies and say we would like to meet with you and tell you what we have, then they probably will, they either will be nearby or they will make a visit at some point. And I know it's harder in some parts of the world maybe to have the people from those companies that you would like to meet with to make decisions.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Peak.